It was a couple years ago that I had this incredible insight about reading exponential roadmaps that I want to share with you. So we've seen this exponential growth curve over and over and over again. The deceptive early growth, 0.01, 0.02, 0.04, and then hitting the knee of the curve, and then 10 doublings later, 1,000 times higher, 20 doublings later, 1,000,000 times, 30 doublings, 1,000,000,000 times. And wouldn't it be amazing if you could, think about and figure out when you're hitting the knee of the curve, to jump onto a technology and to get involved in using that technology at that moment. And I was reading about the early days of ARPANET. Now, ARPA back in the 60s was the Advanced Research Projects Agencies. And ARPA was a part of the military, part of the research industrial complex. And what happened in the 60s were that computers back then were giant room size, expensive, really hard to use assets. And in the United States, there are only a handful of them. There was one at MIT, there was one at Harvard, there was one at Stanford, there was one at University of Illinois, there was one down in DC. And if you didn't live in those cities or at those institutions, gaining access to it was very difficult. So the government, as part of ARPA, said, can we connect those computers together? And more importantly, put terminals in other institutions that will allow researchers and military, those were the two users, researchers and military, to gain access to these national assets, these room-sized computers. In 1969, ARPANET came online. It connected two computers with one connection. A year later, it was 10, very slow growth. By 1981, 213 connected nodes. And of course, it began exploding thereafter. But even so, in the late 80s and early 90s, it was still a very complicated process to use, getting on a terminal and being able to use a computer at MIT or Stanford, until this young man, Marc Andreessen, a graduate student at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, at the age of 23, came up with the concept of Mosaic. This was a browser that sat on top of this archaic network called ARPANET. And Mosaic allowed people to interface with ARPANET in a very easy fashion. It's what I call a user interface moment, when an individual creates a user interface that allows an average individual to use very complex, very limited hardware. So look at these numbers. In 1993, when Mosaic goes online, there are 26 websites. By 1994, there are 10,000 websites. By 1998, there are millions of websites. What is going on here? Well, it's the fact that Mosaic, then becoming Netscape, actually became a platform that allowed other people to build revenue-generating capabilities and useful processes on top of what was then called the internet. So what I look for today is user interface moments. Is there a moment in time when an individual creates a platform or creates an interface that allows a user to use something that before was very difficult to use and to generate money, to generate revenues, to build on top of that? So I'll give you a few examples. The programming languages of the early days, Fortran, was a user interface moment to allow people to use complex IBM computers. And probably the most exciting user interface moment since the development of Mosaic and Netscape has been the iPhone and the App Store. I mean, just think about this, creating this user interface moment where an individual can write a program and download it into the hands of hundreds of millions of users. So what are the stats on the App Store? 300,000 developers since 2008 have written 2 million apps that have been downloaded 140 billion times. You know how much wealth was created? Do you know how simple it became to write an app and get it into the hands of millions of individuals? Extraordinary. So I want you as an entrepreneur to be looking for user interface moments, to see them when they're happening, to see something that was complicated or not available all of a sudden becoming available to everybody, to create platforms that float all boats, that allow others to earn revenue on top of these platforms, on top of these user interface moments. Either build those user interfaces yourself, or when you see them being built, hop on top of them. This is your goal as an exponential entrepreneur, to understand the 6 Ds and to understand the exponential road ahead, to take advantage of those things, to use those things, and to create this world of abundance.